remarks on 5, I would call them macro lessons that we would ignore at our peril. We need to learn these lessons. So let me briefly tell you what I think are those 5 big lessons. First lesson is that unsustainable practices have dire consequences. The pandemic is not, or pandemics in general, are not natural events. A pandemic is as anthropogenic as climate change. It has the same root. Now, a pandemic is a very fast evolving crisis, whereas climate change is a much longer term crisis. And in climate change, we don't have vaccines. It's a little bit more complicated, but the root cause is the same. We have seen an increasing frequency of pandemics since the latter part of the 20th century. And that reflects the invasion of habitats by human beings, the unsustainable and inhumane practices associated with poultry and livestock. That's why we have avian flu, swine flu, and then those crowded and promiscuous so-called wet markets. All of these practices allow pathogens to cross the species barriers from other animals into human. COVID-19 should be a wake-up call about the need to protect our planet. One outcome of the pandemic must be a renewed commitment to sustainable development. Lesson number 2 is that we need to get over the false dilemma between public health and economic goals. I think that's what's hurt a lot of countries. Protecting public health and reactivating the economy should be seen as synergistic goals that need to be pursued together in a comprehensive strategy. As I said earlier, health is not just an outcome of economic growth, it is one of the conditions for economic growth to happen at all. Thanks to COVID-19, governments, businesses, communities, and individuals now clearly know, as our colleague, the senator from Philippines, was saying, that without health, there is no wealth. Third lesson is related to social inequality. In almost all countries of the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected low-income and marginalized groups. This is reflected both in infection rates and in mortality rates, and now we're seeing it in access to vaccines. This reality really demands the design of interventions to deal with the underlying social conditions that allow for high rates of infection and death among vulnerable, marginalized populations. It requires also public policies to improve access to high-quality health care, like the ones I was privileged to introduce, that Sergio was mentioning. In addition, as we prepare for future pandemics, and there will be other pandemics, we must make sure that those preparedness plans include protection to the most vulnerable. Fourth lesson, and probably the most important, is the centrality of leadership in the response to a public health threat. To me, I am a public health professional, and the most striking feature of this pandemic is the huge variation in the effectiveness of national responses, even when you compare countries at the same level of economic development, facing the same virus, we're the same human species, and yet those countries have varied enormously in their response. And as I look around the world, I see one disturbing trend. The worst outcomes are seen in countries that have populist regimes. I am not saying that there's a cause and effect relationship. I am saying that there's an over-representation of populist governments or governments led by populist leaders among the worst responses. And unfortunately, we have an over-concentration of those right here in the Americas. Whether it was the previous administration in the United States or the current administrations in Brazil and Mexico, that's where you see those 3 countries are the 3 countries with the highest numbers of death in the entire world. And that is because populist governments, first of all, they undervalue expertise and undermine science. And then they politicize behavior, because it's at the core of populism to divide people between the good people and the corrupt elites. That's the framework of the populist leader. And one example, which I think has been catastrophic, has been the way in which populist leaders have politicized measures, basic public health measures like wearing face covers. We're now seeing that even with vaccination. And this is the same whether they're right-wing or left-wing populists. They behave exactly the same. It's the populist syndrome. In contrast, the countries that have done very well are actually much more concentrated in Asia. Of course, we have very good exceptions in Latin America, and we'll be hearing from a country that does not have a populist leader, Uruguay. But we have seen better responses in Asia. And where you see the best responses, you see the opposite. You see the basing the response on science and on expertise, uniting people instead of dividing them. And we see them in some of the countries we have today, like Taiwan and South Korea. At the beginning, there was some idea that you needed authoritarian regimes, like in China, to mount an effective result. That is been proven wrong. Democratic regimes that bring people together happen to have had the best performance, and some of them actually have the interesting additional feature that they're led by women. This is the case of Taiwan that we'll be hearing, or another Pacific country like New Zealand. Finally, let me move to the last lesson. This is, of course, a global crisis, and the lesson is very clear. Global problems require global solutions. I am disturbed by the fact that some of these same populist, hyper-nationalistic leaders are using the pandemic as an excuse to insist on a xenophobic, exclusionary, hyper-nationalistic discourse, and that they may use the pandemic as an excuse to advance authoritarian practices. I think it's very important to guard against that. Global problems can only be dealt with global solutions. The best example we have is the amazing level of collaboration among scientists around the world, in academia, in government, and in industry, from all over the world, that have delivered in record times highly safe and effective vaccines. But we need more than that. We need also a sort of new global compact so that we can actually provide better global health security. There are many, many proposals on the table. The Director General of the World Health Organization has proposed a new global health treaty. The important thing is that national governments need to collaborate and understand that pandemics put everyone at risk and no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that will require a new global regime so that countries are willing to share their sovereignty and engage in collective action to face common threats like pandemics or like climate change. I think we have no time to lose. We're in a race between vaccines and variants. We need to make sure that global access to vaccines is expanded. No one will be safe until everyone is vaccinated, and we have no time to lose. The good news is that I do believe we have the capacity to build on the lessons from the pandemic and implement some of these lessons we have learned